go. So, welcome to another Virtual HorrorCon panel, and this time again on Darker Days Radio Twitch. And if you are watching this, please, donate to the following links that'll come up in the thing. There is in the chat. So, donations go to Black Girls Code and to the Blind Cat Rescue and Sanctuary. With that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our guest for this panel, which is Andy Chambers. So, thank you for chatting to me again, Andy. I think the last time we chatted was UK Games Expo 20. Oh, what would it be 2018? Maybe. Yeah.
Really?
I think it was maybe. It was when the card game came out. It was when Dark Days
really?
came out.
Is it that long? I thought we'd talked since then, to be honest.
We talked before then for the podcast, and that when we had Thomas on the podcast as well.
Cool.
But last time we chatted was definitely for UK Games Expo. Now UK Games Expo feels like it's been centuries ago now.
That's in the before times.
In the before times. Hence the reason why we do virtual expo, or virtual conventions such as this.
Can we really call this a panel when there's one of me? What's something that's been bothering me slightly, I must admit.
I know. It originally was going to be a workshop, and I think it's just been a rejig of things as certain things fell out and games or panels fell through, so we've had a rejig of
I think we should have total honesty with whatever audience we have out there at this point. We're here right now because I chickened out from playing your role-playing game.
Don't worry, Ross stepped in and he's going to get murderized, hopefully. Maybe not.
That's kind of what I first saw in my future, and I was like...
Poor guardsman on some awful planet. But yeah, I mean... And that leads us on to what the point of this is, because Andy, you've been through the entire process of games design from top to bottom in some respects. Doing submissions to get your first gig at things, and then onwards to eventually being a lead developer on a well-known IP. And then eventually jumping ship and then being a developer on things like StarCraft and the Judge Dredd games. There's a lot of stuff here to talk about. And I think the thing is, when people ask about how you get started in games, is always those first steps and what they're like. So what was it like, pitching ideas for new content or for the 40k universe, whichever game within that bubble, and the experience of doing that, and being told, yeah, that's great, or yeah, actually maybe not that, and how to accommodate that critique.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I started out, was really in the Warhammer 40,000 universe more than anything else, because I joined the Games Workshop design studio in 1990. So at that point, Rogue Trader had been out for a couple of years, because that came out in 1988. And it had built up a certain number of White Dwarf articles and stuff like that. And there was also kind of what drew me into Games Workshop in the first place. There was Adeptus Titanicus there as well, which again was a kind of another game set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. So they already had an architecture that was there. There was a big framework in place. Rogue Trader laid out a lot about the universe. So the biggest trick early on was fitting in neatly into that universe. They didn't need wild, off-the-wall ideas from nowhere. If I'm honest, nobody ever does. What they needed was things that fitted with what they already had and felt right. And we'll talk about feel a lot over the course of this chat, I'm sure. Because it's not, everything is made up. That is the bottom line. Sorry, folks, it really is. Everything's made up. So what you're trying to make up is something that feels right, that feels true to the environment it's being placed into. And that was the biggest skill set that I managed to bring to bear early on, was making things that fit into the existing framework that had been established over the course of White Dwarf articles, over the course of Rogue Trader and the Adeptus Titanicus game. And my first roles was actually creating more material, basically through White Dwarf for Adeptus Titanicus. So stuff about organizing companies of space marines and stuff like that, because it was a Titans game and it was just creeping into having like tanks and infantry at that point. So there was a lot to go at. And my initial in to the entire environment was submitting an article for some miniatures that had come out that didn't have rules. And this was clearly like, well, that's no good, is it? What's, why would you have miniatures without rules? So I actually wrote up an article and sent it in to them. And they liked it enough and said, all right, come on in, spend a couple of weeks, sort out your article. That extended on as they found other things for me to do, and I found other things to do there, and I got my foot in the door and didn't remove it for 14 years from that point, basically.
And that's quite interesting, because like with I think with the idea, like the miniatures existed, but there wasn't the how they fitted into the world. So, or at least there weren't rules for them, because it's often
it's kind of unimaginable at this point. Of like, what do you mean? Like miniatures came out without rules? It wasn't that uncommon in the late 80s. You had miniatures manufacturers that created sets of miniatures, and you had some people publish rules, but it wasn't necessarily that integrated marketing front that Games Workshop was starting to move into at that point. Games Workshop was unusual because they brought out miniatures, they brought out rules to go with them. That was the way it worked. So it kind of stood out at the time. The reason it came about is because Jervis Johnson at the time was on a bit of a sabbatical for 6 months, basically, having done Adeptus Titanicus. So they had nobody to write the rules, because nobody really understood the game or played it or anything like that. So they were kind of entirely beholden on one person, which exposes one of those vulnerabilities you can get with excessive specialization, shall we say. But as a fan, I was reasonably well placed. I'd kind of rewritten rules myself over the years, just as a kid, for donkey's years, written my own rules and things like that. So it was no big deal to go like, well, this works like that. So,
and by writing content for White Dwarf, that I'm sure at the time was a great way, both fun for yourself, but also for the setting itself to in a very quick and rapid way iterate through ideas and new additions to the setting, rather than going, we've got a brand new big project, a big product to get out there. You can get out these relatively short snippets of, this is how we're expanding the world here, this is how we're expanding the setting here, and building that up.
Yes. Yeah, White Dwarf was always a great boon for this kind of stuff, in that all kinds of material could go in White Dwarf, and it could stay in the long term or not, depending on how it went down, in essence. But also, as we went forward, all the White Dwarf articles in a year go into a compendium, so they were available as part of the range. They didn't just disappear into the ether. Or you could make them disappear into the ether by not putting them in the compendium if that was what you chose, sort of thing. So it actually gave us a facility. And this, you've got to remember, this is days before the internet.
Yeah.
And, getting anything out to anybody meant printing it and selling them books or magazines with it in. So everything moved a lot slower in general.
Yeah, definitely. And so as you say, most of your work was originally on Epic, but then how much do you feel scope did you have as your role progressed and you got given more and more tasks which to write for that game, but also for the setting overall? How much do you feel you got to scope to like further define or pull together things that were there? As you say, Rogue Trader had been a thing for a few years already, that you could now like go, well, actually these fit together and that defines the setting cohesively better.
Yeah, that was a process that started. Rick Priestley did second edition Space Marine, which was kind of like a big tidy up for Adeptus Titanicus, and drew it all together into a far more cohesive system that wasn't entirely focused around Titans. It was a lot more about big armies. And so he wrote that. He wrote the first supplement for that, Armies of the Imperium, which covered how Space Marines worked and how Imperial Guard, as they were called back then, worked as well, in terms of like, at company strength and stuff like that. What would a whole chapter of Space Marines be, and so on. So again, he'd kind of like, he'd established a framework of how this worked and how to portray particular factions in the universe. After that, I got tasked with picking up everybody else, basically. So, I did Eldar, I did Squats, I did Orcs, I did Chaos. And in each case, you had to go through the same sort of process. Well, how do these guys, how do they operate on a big scale?
Yeah.
How do they fight not just a skirmish or a battle, but a whole war? What do their large-scale formations look like? Do they still have companies? Do they have, war bands or hordes or what have you? And I'd been a historical gamer up until that point as well, so I got kind of grounding in stuff like World War II and ancient battles and things like that. I could bring to bear on all of that and give a shape to it that kind of made sense. So you could get, equivalent strengths of Eldor or what have you in their war hosts to fight against the Imperial Guard in their regiments and so on and so on. We didn't really think of it in those terms, but what we were doing at that point was actually taking that framework that Rick had established and actually, building walls out of it, making more and more architecture out of it, making it more and more of a cohesive front about how things worked in the universe. It was still a really big, mad universe with uncounted worlds and mutants and chaos and magic and all this sort of stuff going on in it. But we'd actually established some sort of like rules about how it worked, and that again helped to build up this idea of it having a cohesive background, that there was a kind of truth to it.
Yeah.
That you could get your head around.
And yeah, I mean, Space Marine. I think actually, Space Marine is mostly the first thing I started. Epic Space Marine was the first thing I started collecting. Actually, and that was an Eldar Force, definitely. But then, obviously, 40k second edition. There's that draw to finally go. We need a new edition. So, I think I've read elsewhere, other interviews that the main thing, as you point out, there's so much content in White Dwarf and in Citadel, not the compendiums and so.
It was and journal as well.
Yeah, exactly, and the drive to like centralize that information, because that's the thing that always happens when you've got a great magazine that pushes new content. Is it bloats out everywhere, and then at some point you're like, how many books do I need to bring along to play this game?
That does become your physical. It certainly did back then. The physical bar starts to be like, how many books do I have to carry to have a game? And it got to too many with Rogue Trader and First Edition, and it kind of clearly needed a tidy up and a kind of drawing all into one place. Plus, when Rick had originally written Rogue Trader, he kind of had a skirmishy, maybe you have a GM sort of an idea behind it, much like early Warhammer as well. What most players want. I mean, we know this well from like D&D and RPGs and so forth. He's like, it's great if you can have a GM, but getting a group of people and finding somebody to be that person all the time isn't always easy. Finding a couple of people that want to have a game with each other, that's relatively straightforward. But then you need the rule book to be more of a GM. You need to give more direction and like, this is how it works. This is how you set up a game. This is how you win a game. And Rogue Trader didn't do very much of that because it was trying to cover everything. So bit of a change of direction, and a lot of work had been done on things like army lists and so on in compendiums and through White Dwarf, and an opportunity to sort of like rationalize all of those, because they were, if I'm honest, all over the place in terms of power level and points values and just everything. So they needed a bit of dragging together. Oh, we mustn't forget we also had all the Wargly Orc stuff going off in the background as well when we're talking about power level. So yeah, it needed a rationalization, and this is a fact of life, as anybody who's played games for a while has started to realize this, particularly now when supplemental material comes out so fast. The whole game gets destabilized after a while. With the best will in the world, you can't help but that happens just through the sheer magnitude of additional things that get put onto it. And you get codex creep and all those other kind of phenomena that we're very well aware of now because publishing works at such a rate. Not quite so obvious back then, as I say.
It's interesting when you say that, because it's funny how, like, some, as you say, some games bloat and creak under the pressure of conflicting rules and stretching what is possible with the way you use your mechanics. And then it's quite curious. Like recently, I noticed like with Guild Ball, that was a really fun game, but it's quite interesting that they ended production on that because they felt like they reached the limits of what you could do with the game to accommodate new factions, and I find that interesting from a game balance point of view, because that's obviously a very different type of game, because that really did play into tournament players, and I think that also is an interesting lesson that if you play too much to that hand, you can.
Yeah, this is it. The tighter you screw everything down, absolutely, the more robust your system will be, the less vulnerable it will be to things like creep and imbalance coming in. But also the less flexibility it's going to have over the long term to add more stuff in. So it's very much a trade-off of like, how tightly do you want to wind everything down? How much do you want to limit people's choices, which is where a lot of it comes from. The more choices you give to players, the more you're opening the door to imbalance to come in. And there's just no two ways about it. People talk about playtesting like it's some magical fix for this, and it really isn't. The simple fact of life is that you give people more flexibility, there's going to be more possibility for imbalance there.
Oh yeah, and I think the great thing about the day and age we're in, certainly when we can meet in person and play games much more readily, is the fact that playtesting is possible, especially when you have got when your game producer does have a good kind of playtest pool, as it were. I think modern, current Games Workshop does that a lot more. I think they have a lot bigger playtest pool for, like, generally from like the tournament players to figure, because they're the people that work out the nonsense exploits and go, that's crazy, don't let that ever exist because we don't want to see it. But that's but then also I think with the new edition with 40k, it's like, and this is maybe thinking about product design and development from like the visual language and identity of it, because I think for me personally, like, that's where I really got into Games Workshop products, and I think 40k second edition still has quite a distinct like language of what it looks like, how it feels, and how much of a role did you have in kind of fostering that look of the setting in that incarnation? Because I mean that also feeds into what we then eventually see in like third edition as well. I think that really, and I personally don't think 40k has deviated too much from the look that really comes from second ed.
Yeah, we did really start to nail it down quite hard in second edition, it must be said. First of all, by having a very cohesive sort of like big box set, which had books in about all of the different factions and kind of like laid out the groundwork very strongly there. And then we sort of followed up with pretty meaty codexes over that.
They were meaty.
They were,
Chaos
up to like
was brilliant, and Tyranids is just nuts. And is a firm favourite of mine because that was my first 40k army, is Tyranids. But yeah, they were massive. I mean, again, the amount of world building in there, there's so much stuff which even today is just, hasn't changed much.
Yeah, it was a great opportunity to establish a lot of foundation work over the course of those for each of those different factions. And again, we were kind of building on all that knowledge base that had been built up over the course of doing Epic, of course, because a lot of it was, well, we know how this works. We just need to render it into 40k scale for more of the kind of skirmish battle rather than the big company battle. So it was a good opportunity. And we'd had some great writers. I was thinking about this actually before we met up. Another factor that you have to think about in the Games Workshop studio is there was a big RPG base of knowledge that was there, who'd done Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and stuff like that, which also kind of bled across into doing the Lost and the Damned books. Yeah. And that always kind of like that, I think, drew excellence, for want of a better term, from doing 40k, of like, it had to live up to a certain standard of having a background that was like big and meaty and interesting and had all those little fiddly bits that kind of make it good. And some of the techniques that we used, I think, were very successful in terms of like little slices of color text salted around in the books, quotations and stuff like that, which gave it a lot of flavor. And that was carried forward from Rogue Trader. But we sort of like really heavily adopted it and kind of leaned into that quite hard, because it gave you a lot of legs to say a lot in 250 words or 500 words by having just like a little patch of color text or a nice quote.
Definitely. And
almost like artwork can give you that much just out of that small box space on a page.
Yes, yeah.
So
it's incredible. I think 40k second edition, it's amazing the the longevity of it in some respects, because obviously it's forms the core foundation rules wise as well to like Necromunda, and modern Necromunda is still pretty much classic Necromunda under the hood. It's just been expanded even further, and it's, and again, like Necromunda is a wonderful example of where, you know, within building a setting, building products, and thinking about visual identity and the language of a setting, is that this is where you can is a slice through a set. It's not even a slice actually, because it's not a top to down or a horizontal. It's just like this little world here in everything else. How does developing how did developing, say, for Necromunda, and likewise, I mean, Gorka Morka is an example as well, and so is Battlefleet Gothic in its own respect as well, because that's in a sector of the galaxy, compared to world building for a game which takes place on a galactic scale. I mean, the questions you must be thinking and wanting to answer to render these worlds and places for people must be quite different.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, one of the biggest challenges with 40k, and this was particularly the case with the Tyranids, actually, was taking something that worked on a galactic scale and trying to make it, you know, understandable what individuals were like from that particular race, what their motivations were, how they fought, and stuff like that. So not getting completely sort of like phased by the fact that you then got to talk about them on a galactic scale as well. You need a little from both, because of course, if you get too much into the individualism of it, then, you know, you've got a bunch of guys that live in a bar and shoot people for a living. Actually, that's a different game, isn't it?
Yeah, that is a different game.
Which is kind of where you get to Necromunda as an opportunity to like bore in really, really tight and have a look at just a little slice of life in one corner of the galaxy. Those games represent, again, fantastic opportunities to do that. Because again, the 40k universe has been built to allow for infinite numbers of worlds, infinite numbers of different individuals, and potentially factions and all the rest of it, as much as you wanted to fill in. It was very much not a cut and dried universe by design, because it was there to be expandable.
It's quite interesting how how elastic the setting can be, both for how it's displayed in novels, where, you know, you get to see, well, I think it's really interesting because you get to see the 40k universe away from the front lines. Like, it's always war, we understand, but it's like the war becomes not the thing in your face, but the thing in the background, or the memories of it are lurking around. And that's very clear in, say, I mean, in particular, like with the Eisenhorn trilogy, you know, there's Eisenhorn goes to worlds where they're not on the front lines. They're not.
Yeah, they're not even fighting a battle here, crying out loud.
What's
yes.
that about? And you get to see how what we feel is like, you know, the Imperium and so forth. You get to see a lot more variation of how it's interpreted on a particular world by a particular group of people, and that's, I think, the really fun thing with it. And there's also something which is always that I have in the back of my head when I've been doing anything writing, and in particular most recently writing for Vampire the Masquerade, because in that they established very early on, you've got the Camarilla, you've got the Sabbat, and they kind of became, I feel to some players, they became this monolithic, that's how it is, and it's like, it's much more fun to try and find where can you poke holes in it and upend the status quo and slay some sacred cows and go, actually, these guys are a bit different. They're still the Sabbat, or they're still the Imperium, but barely. And I think that's where Necromunda does it really well, because you get to see interpretations of like the Imperial Creed with like the Redemptionists and House Cawdor, or likewise how the Imperial noble houses also interpret the rules. How much of your world building is influenced by the times that you were writing those in, you know, the political landscape at the time? Because 40k has and Warhammer likewise has a fair bit of satire underlying bits, and is making some points about how certain things aren't great.
Yeah, it's a stinging satire of authoritarian
Yeah,
regimes, is what it is. It was written after we'd been living under conservative rule at that point for 18 years.
yeah.
If you can imagine that, we're heading that way again now, and it was
Mm,
grim, man. It was grim. We saw it all the time. We saw the bureaucracy and just heartlessness of your rulers. So yeah, like most comics and music at the time, we satirized the hell out of it because that's about all we could do in terms of striking back.
I guess
And
Mike Pondsmith's classic quote of about Cyberpunk the RPG is Cyberpunk is a warning, not an aspiration.
absolutely,
Yeah. Um, excellent. And I'm trying to think what's the so I guess actually this is a good question as well when especially I think Necromunda's possibly a great example of this because obviously Necromunda had a forerunner in
mm,
with Confrontation, not the Confrontation of Rackham, that's a completely different game system.
yes.
But you know what comes first? Is it is it a bit of text here? The gameplay? Is it some art and some miniatures that are lurking around in the studio that someone's just done and they just don't have any rules for yet? Yeah, how does that work? Or is it just is there no magic recipe and it's just like it just comes
Um,
together?
so some of it is ugly and just commercial at
Yeah,
the end of the day. I mean, um, as to why we did Necromunda in particular, we were going through a period at the time where Tom Kirby had bought the company and wanted to establish its credentials as being a games company.
yeah,
Because it was very miniatures focused company more than anything else. It was Citadel Miniatures that basically consumed Games Workshop and took on the name of it, but it was Citadel, scratch the surface, it was Citadel Miniatures underneath. And okay, they made some games to push their miniatures and so on, but he was going to put it on the stock market, so he wanted to have more of a kind of like a library of games available
yeah,
than just a handful. So we got onto a schedule whereby we were doing 2 big box games a year for a while.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
unsurprisingly, anything that had been looked at previously got looked at again
Yeah,
and potentially drawn out as, oh, we could just do this. Look, we've done a load of work for it already. And that really is why Confrontation
yeah,
got back up again as Necromunda. But it got a serious reworking because Confrontation, it had some interesting ideas and so on. The core concepts were there, but the way it had been rendered didn't really have enough of a hard edge. It was a bit 1980s by the time we came to look at it in the mid 90s. So it needed to be a bit more 90s.
yeah,
Um, so it got a pretty heavy beat down on that. But the broad ideas of hive cities and noble houses and layers to the hive, being in the hive bottom and so forth was there and established from Confrontation. So it was building on that. But
it still
looking at
stays with
ours,
me now. It still stays with me now because writing for Wrath and Glory, we're like, right, how do we take the concepts of hive cities and put them on other worlds that are somewhat different to Necromunda? Like,
hmm,
how does a hive city work on an ocean world, which begs the question of like what happens when it starts sinking into the oceans. These are the questions I ask myself when writing things, and my lead developer were like, how does this work, what are they doing? Like, we don't want to replicate Necromunda, we're not allowed to replicate Necromunda because they how IPs and everything are managed, but we're still like wondering
hmm.
like how do we get that feel but still be kind of like this distinct world. So that's how important it is in to me currently. I'm always still flipping back to the old books as well, even because there's still things that's in there that haven't migrated to the new ones even. Um, so yeah, I mean, as you say, it's a very commercial thing. It's quite interesting what you said about how it was that drive to become a games company because like later on, like only until most recently, Games Workshop was considering itself, oh, we're a miniatures company, and now it's moved back
Yeah.
to making
The
lots of
story
games.
changed a little bit, past 2000 once they had their factory
Yes,
in place and so on.
but it's I'm also like quite happy to see that they're back making so many different games again.
Mm.
Like I think in
Well,
this,
it's actually very healthy.
yeah,
What it does is it helps to refresh your IP, it helps to expand your IP. And like I say, we weren't doing that consciously in the
mm-hmm,
course of the 90s, but that's what we were doing. And again, we established foundations and expandable bits, which are serving really well now more than 20 years later, because of the kind of legwork that was done at that point. And much like with Confrontation, then morphing into Necromunda later, having some groundwork done does help. It really does help, because at that level, you've already got a little bit of buy-in, you've got some art to go with it and stuff, and that's can be enough to start the ball rolling.
And I mean, the legacy of Battlefleet Gothic is definitely there, because it influences Blackstone Fortress, which I love, and the fact that you're adventuring in these nightmare space stations is amazing. And again, it just shows that those early structures are just now. I feel actually now, they're like finally germinating, pollinating trees that have been waiting for a while. But I guess, given that you worked on you worked on Rogue Trader and Epic, producing new content, then co-leading a new edition, then leading a new edition in the case of third edition. That leads to the thing of things where we've seen like the Black Crusade, and that was a big global campaign, and then it got pulled back. So how, as a lead developer, do you deal with, or when do you know, or how do you deal when the command comes from on high, from a marketing point of view, to take the editorial machete and do some retcons and go, well, okay, I think those need to change because it didn't quite work the way we wanted it to, or the community really doesn't quite like how that's playing out, or those rules are completely nuts and they need a fix. How do you just approach that? Because that's kind of like whether you see that as a critique of your own work, or it's just hindsight and you suddenly like, okay, that was not quite where we wanted it to go.
Yeah, I don't know. That is something in the Games Workshop sense I don't have a tremendous amount of experience with, if I'm honest. I was gone by 2004, and the kind of feedback loop that you get now didn't exist then at all. We used to get letters by snail mail occasionally. There were message boards out there in the world that you could go and look at, but it's the internet, so people are hyperbolic by nature on the internet. So you have to kind of like wonder how much attention you should really pay.
Yes,
I took it seriously when it came to the rules front, because we kind of had the tools to deal with issues that came through from tournament organizers and stuff like that. This is a problem. But in that broader sense of like the feedback from the general public, there just wasn't really the means or the tools to deal with that at that time. And marketing that tried to dictate what way the background went would be sent away with a flea in its ear in my period. In general.
But I mean, going from like, I guess this leads, I guess a different way of looking at things then is, say, the change from second edition to third edition, and also like the change of any edition of a game, or I guess because that had a change of the rules in some significant ways, I guess brings us to the big question of when you're designing supplements and games, and about rules, how much do rules matter to get across the feel, the tone of the product or the faction or the miniature, whatever it is. How and how does that work? Maybe I guess that also works into the layout of a book, because if you lay out the rules badly, they can be interpreted in the wrong way.
Oh, absolutely. I feel it's really, really important. I think it's absolutely key that you have rules that, again, feel right. Just as you need to have art that looks and sort of like evokes the right sort of thinking and, ideas about the background you're trying to portray, and your background text should do the same thing as well. The rules have to support that too. You can't have the art showing one thing, the background text saying another thing, and then the rules doing something entirely different from that. So there's always that rub there of everything should work together, and it should evoke the right feel of how people fight for particular factions. Very big on that.
Because my feeling is like sometimes you see people try to shoehorn the same rule set on for any type of game, any type of, whether it's like a fantasy game or a sci-fi game or a modern one, and you're kind of left like thinking, I think you're stretching it with what the rule system was originally intended to do and simulate, versus what you're trying to do now, and it's quite clear, like, you know, you could play a massive game of Warhammer Fantasy, but then you could also just equally play War Master that represents that scale, and actually in some respects better represents how armies operate at that scale.
But it must be said, gamers of all stripes, if you give them a set of rules and say, this is for playing, you know, a 2,000-point game, they will be playing a 6,000-point game of it at some point.
Yes.
And probably a 500-point game of it as well. So it does need to have a certain amount of flex to it. I think that's one of the marks of a good set of rules, is it does have that amount of flex. But fundamentally, yeah, you're right. When you write a set of rules, you're trying to portray a certain level of conflict, a certain way of fighting and so on, and the rules work to support that. That being said, there's also an argument that you can get too stuck up your own bum trying to be too clever about things.
Yeah.
And particularly in terms of like turning over editions, and I had some experience of this myself, you can change things too much between different editions of a game. And you can take one thing that's pretty much like another thing, write an entirely different set of rules for it, when in fact you probably should have just used the same rules again with a few tweaks. I've had this lesson with Strontium Dog and Judge Dredd, or rather I've learned this lesson by the time I got Strontium Dog and Judge Dredd, because they use the same rule system. People are just grateful overall that they use the same rule system. They're happy that they don't have to learn a new one. It's just more stuff if they're into both games. And that's kind of a positive. And that's ironically one of the things that we had with Warhammer 40,000 was it was the same core rule system that was just being applied in different ways. But because we had codex books, we could take each army, stick in some rules that applied just to that army, potentially. And again, it's what you said before about it being a very robust and flexible system that could accept those things. People like to rag on the balance of 40k, but man, oh man, you didn't see the games that we used to play in the 80s, that's for sure. We came a long way very fast, believe me.
I mean, the reaction to a rule set being changed when it's for essentially the same game, but, you know, has a different feel. I mean, I guess that's the reaction to, like, you know, when you had Epic Space Marine, Epic Titan Legions, and you have the reaction to Epic 40,000. You know, but some of the underpinning rules in Epic 40,000 obviously then are within Battlefleet Gothic, where they're, you know, loved by everyone. But in Epic 40,000, there were people from the old school who were like, that isn't my kind of epic. But I think it's the new edition of 40k Armageddon, and I don't have enough miniatures to play on that scale, let alone have enough time to paint that much or anything. But I think they use blast markers or something equivalent to that now. So it's 40k.
A blast marker was a brilliant.
I love it because it's a tactile.
It's a brilliant innovation.
It's a tactile way of representing a game mechanic of what's going on, what mess is happening, and it's for the same reason I love in the new edition of Vampire that we have that they went from having blood pools, which are basically like mana pools, to hunger dice, which are these. You go, how hungry is my vampire? You've got 4 hunger dice. You're like, okay, that's out of 5. You've got that in your hands. You know something bad's going to happen with those dice. And when they roll, all hell's going to break loose. And it's unpredictable as well, compared to, you know, you're constantly topping up your blood pool.
You're keeping track of something.
I'm a big proponent of those, of if any way you can get that kind of tactile element of being reminded of what's going on within a game. So, I mean, that brings us then, as you said, I think this brings us totally to what you've gone through, kind of like the different steps of your career through, you know, Games Workshop, developing stuff for 40k and onwards. I mean, you've written also you wrote for the Skaven book, which was like 6th edition, was it? No. It wasn't 6th edition. I can't remember.
I think 5th. I'm not sure. I'm not really very au fait with Warhammer editions. I must confess. It was early on. It was like early 90s because it was the first Skaven book. So.
But how does
the first High Elf book as well, by the way.
Yeah. How does all of that inform then how you've gone forward in developing games where you've you're again on a well developed IP, which maybe you've not had as much, you've not had as much ability to form because you weren't there in those early days. So like with StarCraft, and again, like as you said, with Strontium Dog and Judge Dredd, like what lessons?
I'm really comfortable with it by this point, because a lot of my career has involved being, dropped into an IP on one level or another and, asked to expand on it. And from my perspective, I think for anybody who's out there, it's an essential skill to have. There's going to be far more opportunities to work on something that's already established, especially now as IPs get bigger and bigger, than there is to like strike out on your own with your own brilliant acorn of an idea. So it's a skill for everyone. And actually, it's a lot of fun. If you look at it in the right way, you're not having your choices limited so much as you're having opportunities pointed out to you.
Excellent.
One of my little adages that I tell people is the most terrifying words for me to hear in the world are, "We could do anything."
yeah. That's for sure. I think because that leads into the thing of like being careful of when you're designing a product, keeping to the brief, and if you've got one that helps you, because then you know what you should be doing, rather than I'll start doing this, and it's like you just bloated the game. You've not delivered a product, and then those deadlines start creeping up on you where you need to deliver something. And if you're told you can do anything,
the opening phase is really, really important on that level. Of establishing what you're going to do. Because the fact is that you and probably many others are going to pour immense efforts into producing the book or the game or what have you. So get a clear picture of where you're going before you start, for Christ's sake. Don't try and kind of wander there, because that never works out well.
No. I mean, I'm learning that a lot right now with managing a big programming, bit of software design, and having these conversations very early on with your stakeholders or with your project partners is important, so they know what they're doing. You can then manage when they need to be brought onto a project or when they don't need to be there and they can do something else. Because otherwise it becomes a mess. I'm just looking at the amount of time we've got left. So, really, I think now is the best point, I guess, to talk a bit more about more up-to-date things you've been working on, and maybe how, I guess the approach, the novelty in those things compared to, say, older war games like 40k, because like. I've not played Blood Red Skies, but I am aware it's got some quite innovative ways of, again, representing on the board within the game what's going on rules-wise with the altitude and speed and damage. So, do you want to give us a quick overview of that game, and what challenges have been within designing it, and what's come out of it which you were quite surprised about?
Blood Red Skies kind of spiraled out actually from Battlefleet Gothic in a way. In the course of doing Battlefleet Gothic, I had to give consideration about whether to do like a 3D mechanic for it of some kind. And I basically came to the conclusion, it wasn't worth it. All it is a range multiplayer of some description when you're in space, because there's no gravity, there's no up and down. Aircraft are very different, of course.
Yeah. And
that kind of idea sat until I got into flying online for a while, and it was pretty much a simulator style game that we were playing. So you had to learn to fly, and that brought all the Newtonian physics crashing home in a very literal sense at times about how altitude matters, but not in terms of the actual number of feet up in the air you are. It's just whether you are higher or lower than your opponent, which is kind of the way I've been thinking about it in Battlefleet Gothic. Which gave rise to me, particularly after reading a lot of ace biographies and stuff like that. I got really into the World War II flying for a bit. I read a load of ace biographies, and also a book that gets recommended if you get into enough online flying, which is called Fighter Combat, which is like the US Top Gun school. It's like the written findings of those, a number of different papers put together. So it's all about G-forces and wing loading and shit like this. Anyway, when you read aces talking about air combat, they talk about having the advantage, or not having the advantage and pressing the advantage when you have it and stuff like that. And what they mean is being in a position where, due to either location or your height in relation to your enemy or both, you can get the drop on them in simple terms. And I thought, well, every single tabletop air combat game I've ever played has always involved like carefully keeping track of everything and pre-plotting your movement, and that's not really the way it works out. Not in real life air combat. So I set out to try and create a tabletop game that replicated it. And something also because of my background of doing sort of like fairly mass combat games, which would let you run a lot of aircraft at once. Not just like one or two where you had to pre-plot your movement, or three if you really knew the game well, sort of thing. And because it revolved around that very simple concept of like, well, you're either advantaged or you're neutral or you're disadvantaged, I kept the stats very simple as well. Just a rating for speed in terms of inches, which was based on the real world speed of the aircraft, because working with World War II, you have established stats you can work with. And then beyond that, like an agility and a firepower rating. Just like each is either 1, 2, or 3.
Yeah.
You're either sort of like, yeah, or okay, in the middle, or actually pretty good at that. With the underlying idea that pilots were actually more important than their planes to a large extent. The pilot skill ranges between 2 and 5. And basically, when you shoot at somebody, you add your pilot skill to your firepower. That's the number of dice you roll. When you get hit by somebody, you add your pilot skill to your agility. That's the number of dice you roll to dodge it. So actually, in many ways, the pilot is more important than the plane in terms of the raw stats that you get out of it. But they're a constant. So the plane's got a lot of utility in its speed and it's what it's adding to your pilot and so on.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. The idea of like the trying to get it down to that. I guess you create then a game that's much more responsive by saying you're not planning out moves. It's much more dynamic then. As you say, like if you're playing a computer game, fighter game like that, again, you're not planning out moves. You're just there trying to keep it level and
pretty much, and chase guys or get away from guys that are chasing you, sort of thing.
And it's interesting, that approach, because I think that also is a similar approach you had to when we were chatting about the design for Drop Fleet Commando versus Battlefleet Gothic again, because in that game, it's range doesn't matter. It's about do I have a sensor lock on you or do I not? And the fact that your ships heat up, and I like the sound of how in all of those games they're effectively the same sort of game, things moving around trying to tail each other and blast the crap out of each other, but yet still fundamentally through the use of the rules get a completely different vibe. Yeah.
It's the feeling. That's the important thing. And this is what I've learned over the course of doing many games designs over the course of 30 odd years is the mechanics of the rules. Yeah, they're important, but having a lot of them doesn't make them better.
Yeah.
In some ways, you want less of them because then the ones that you do have become more important. They come to the fore more. And I learned this more than anything else from Jervis Johnson, because he was an expert at doing this kind of thing, like rendering things down to what was important. And if you look at Blood Bowl as one of the best examples of that, and actually one of the best designed games that Games Workshop makes, because it really does like hive in. And so that I've always aspired to that kind of an approach to it. And in those couple of games, it started to pay off in terms of like, well, what if range wasn't important? What if we just took away the arbitrary sort of like, you have a 45 centimeter range or what have you, and said, no, you've got infinite range. All that matters is if you can see them.
I mean, it informed the way, because it was the thing I said at the time was like when I was co-designing Noble Armada 3rd edition and like making sure it didn't feel like Battlefleet Gothic. It's like, we've got spaceships. They're not these huge mile-long behemoths there, and the science is kind of different. And the thing that's different in that game is that the faster you go, the less shields you have, because I think we wrote into like you're slamming through you're basically, the faster you go, you're slamming through like virtual particles that happen in the void of space. So it's like the Casimir effect. And then we realized, like, why do smaller ships go can go ultimately faster. And it was like we actually figured out we had more design space. It's like, well, if they've got two ships that are the same, but they have different shield profiles, so they could slip through the energy vacuum. So that was a fun discovery through going through the thought process, but ultimately leads to a game that is different to other spaceship games out there. And then with Judge Dredd and Strontium Dog, again, they're skirmish games, much like Necromunda. But how are you injecting the flavour of Judge Dredd into those then? How does that manifest? Other than the miniatures themselves, of course.
Yes, imagery first and foremost.
First and foremost, yeah.
Yeah, which is a great boon for doing the rule books as well, because you have years worth of comic strips to pull marvelous images from. The primary way we've done it with Strontium Dog and Judge Dredd is through cards. We've got in Strontium Dog, there's two kinds of cards. You got armory cards, and you got chicanery cards. And armory cards came about from this very simple thing of, like, when you look at Strontium Dog comic strips, sometimes Johnny Alpha, who's the protagonist in it all, or sometimes his opponents, will whip out these amazing pieces of technology, time bombs and stuff like that, which fling you into the past so that you appear in vacuum because the planet's moved on and things like this. And he has this amazing gun that occasionally he can just say number 3 cartridge or number 4 cartridge, and it'll blow things to buggery when it's normally just a pew gun. So we needed a way to accommodate that. And gamers being gamers, if we said, oh, you are issued with one number 3 cartridge and one number 4 cartridge at the beginning of the game, they're just going to shoot them at the first thing they see.
Yeah.
Every time.
They'll do that obvious alpha strike straight away, won't they?
Yeah, every time, So we thought, all right, let's take those off and we'll put them onto cards instead, so we can have time bombs and all that sort of stuff. And it's always good for, like, single-use grenades. No, that's from 40k second edition, where you get to have throw a grenade and, like, here's my card, ha 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 ha. It goes back to what you were saying before about having a good tactile feel for it. Being able to announce off your army list that you have X, Y, Z thing isn't the same as being able to flip over a card and say, ha ha, check it out, I've got this.
And that's where a lot of the fun comes in with a lot of these games. I mean, you get it in Necromunda now with the new gang tactic cards. I think it's in the newer edition of the Batman miniatures game. Again, that has a form of tactic cards and so forth. Is that just you just want that spontaneity, because it's not chess ultimately. I mean, it doesn't. I think that's the thing that annoys me with war games, and it even annoys me more with RPGs. They're not white room exercises. You set up the terrain, you're there having a bit of fun, and what makes it more fun is when
memorable
what you
events
thought was good goes off angle, and you just have
memorable
to
events.
with it.
But it's some reverse Uno card territory and stuff like that is very, very good. And it's kind of ironic because we went through a period where we did cards, loads of cards all the time, and then it kind of stopped because it got expensive to produce cards. And now kind of design, as you say, the design space has moved back around again to remembering that cards are actually very, very useful tools as a designer. They're very, you can give an enclosed little block of rules on a card for something that happens occasionally, and not burden your main rule set down with having, every possible eventuality. It also makes it easy to design new material as well, because you can just design some new cards for it.
The classic example of that is Kingdom Death. Is that you want some more randomization? There's a new random deck beyond what's the random tables in books. And what other one was I going to say? And the classic example, going back again to another company which I feel, even by today's standards of Kickstarters, I still think had one of the most over-designed but luxurious box games ever, was Rackham's Hybrid, their little dungeon crawler kind of game.
Oh, I don't know it. But I believe you.
The amount of text on a small card was like...
Oh, you got to watch that, man.
Like a novel. It was
again,
ridiculous.
I got good training for this sort of thing from Games Workshop, where it was like, well, if it's going to go into German, then the text will be 25% longer, so don't put too much text on there in the first place. Seriously. And it's a good skill to have, it really is.
That's a really interesting point, actually, with translation. I'd never thought of that. how having looked at documents in when I was living in Germany, how much longer the same sentence would be.
I can't remember who told me, but they told me like it was a fact. So I always just took it as like, well, that's a fact then. If it's going to be German, it's 25% longer.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. That's a really good last lesson for designing books and content is think about how long it's going to be in another language. We've totally run out of time, but I really hope that people who have been watching this, I know for Virtual HorrorCon, we're still quite early in the morning for some people in Eastern time, but obviously you can come back to this
about
video
that too.
whenever you like. It'll be put on YouTube at a later date as well. If you have any further questions or anything, just forward them to darkerdaysradio@gmail.com. You can get to us on Twitter at darkerdaysradio. You please donate, as I say, to the Tiltify for the charity. And Andy, what stuff have you got to plug? There must be some fun things.
I was about to say, today, believe it or not, this very day, we've got a Kickstarter going for Blood Red Skies Digital. Basically, some lovely chaps, the guys who did Aeronautica Imperialis as a computer game on Steam, are doing a digital version of Blood Red Skies. Or they will do if we can get the funding for it from doing this Kickstarter. So that starts off at 6 p.m. GMT, 1 o'clock for you guys.
Curious, because hold on, it's Blood Red Skies is not grid based in any form, is it? So
no.
Oh, I'm intrigued how that gets translated to computer game format.
It's a faithful reproduction of the tabletop game. So it has cards as well. Speaking of cards and things like that. And, you know, these guys have poured their hearts into it and done a really lovely job so far. And the prototype they've got running looks great.
Brilliant.
And works really, really well. So, yeah, if you are at all interested in what I'm talking about Blood Red Skies, this could be a great opportunity to try it out without having to commit to getting models or anything like that. And they're doing it so you can play against the PC. You can play head-to-head as well, is the plan.
Excellent.
Assuming we can get funding for it. So
we will have that link on the Twitter and on the Facebook then for you. That is fantastic. Right, we are totally out of time. I'm going to thank you again for taking your time out to chat to me once more about the creative process and the trials and tribulations of wargaming. I hope everyone finds it exciting and informative for if they are going down their own processes of making their own games, because I think there's lots and lots of good lessons in this. But that is all for now, and we'll say goodbye, I think.
Goodbye, folks.
Bye.